Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, audience, for sticking with us this long. It's been a great day, but we appreciate the sun is shining and everyone wants to get outside. We were the Sheffield team, along with our colleague Francesca Strumei, who cannot be with us. Iryna has subsequently left Sheffield, but we still continue to work on this project together. So our focus in the MIGRATE project was on the impact of the migrant crisis on EU integration. And our full findings from our research on that topic are in the Routledge book chapters. Everyone's been talking about this book is going to be published from Routledge, and that's where our main findings are. What we're going to focus on today in this presentation is a very particular aspect of our findings, and that's around learning. The idea or the question of what the EU has learned in terms of integration from the crisis. So just to clarify some of the kind of the definitions and the parameters that we're working within, our notion of EU integration is about to be clear, it's the integration of the EU as an institution rather than the integration of migrants in the EU. So I'm a migration scholar, and when I talk about integration, people think I'm talking about the integration of migrants. But in this particular project, what we were interested in was the integration of the European Union, which we understand in terms of that integration as very broadly as structuring the relationship amongst the existing member states, as well as widening to include new member states, so processes of accession, enlargement, and additionally the shaping of the relationship with exiting member state or states. We don't know what will happen in the future. And that third element emerged because we started this project a few months after the referendum in the UK, and the result of that, of course, was that the UK very narrowly voted to leave the European Union. We voted for Brexit, very narrowly voted for Brexit. And migration was central to the campaign amongst the Brexiteers. So those who wanted to leave the EU instrumentalised migration in general, as well as the migrant crisis more specifically. So we saw earlier in the day that poster in the Hungarian context, but was also used in the UK by UKIP of fake poster, queues of people kind of arriving into European borders. So we became interested in this project also on the relationship between the migration crisis and Brexit and how that was fitting into understandings of EU integration post-crisis. When we talk about learning, we're talking about EU integration. So what has the EU learned about EU integration, not what the EU has learned about migration or the integration of migrants, which was a question that Marcia asked this morning, and a really important question that we should be thinking about. What has the EU learned about migration in all of this story? But we're interested today in what the EU has learned about its own integration. People have given their definitions of the migrant crisis, which we broadly share, as a set of interlocking challenges in the EU, at the heart of which was the large influx of migrants in that period of 2015 and 16. We title our presentation kind of the post-migrant crisis, the aftermath of the migrant crisis. And what we mean by that is that the immediate crisis is over. We've heard that just earlier, but there are ongoing repercussions and continuities. So there's still the challenges of the treatment, how to treat, how to deal with the presence of so many refugees. For example, in the Greek case, is still a very prominent concern. We've noted already today the increasing arrivals to Greece. So it's not that the numbers are slowing. There's been an increase in the numbers, and the new conflict in Syria with Turkey. Someone used the term Turkey's instrumentalization of refugees, but we could also call it the weaponization of refugees in the context of its anti-EU rhetoric. So what we're going to do in this presentation is I'm going to pass over to Iryna, who's going to outline some of the theoretical frameworks that exist around conceptualizing EU integration in relation to this idea of learning, and particular organizational learning. We're going to say a little bit about our data and the methods we use to collect them, and then introduce some of our findings in terms of learning in EU integration after the migrant crisis.
So I'm going to explain now how we framed our presentation in relation to conceptualizing EU integration as learning. So for this, we looked at two main bodies of literature, and one of them was EU integration after the migrant crisis, the literature that was written after 2015. And there's literature that discusses this idea as crisis being tipping points in some changes, as drivers of some changes. There is a couple of studies actually that link the migrant crisis to changes in European integration, but the actual main point of it is that the migrant crisis is a conglomerate of different crises, so we shouldn't be talking only about rising numbers of migrants, but actually it's about the financial, economic, and external relations aspects of it as well. So crises are integral to a cyclical process of integration, and that has been the case with a lot of other crises that the EU encountered in the past, but in this case, this is actually now threatening the existence of the EU as an institution. So then we looked at another couple of studies that theorize EU integration in relation to a couple of crises, but the interesting point here is that there are so many of these theories, and none of them actually explains why different crises may lead to different integration outcomes. So you can see that we've got institutionalism, intergovernmentalism, new intergovernmentalism, liberal intergovernmentalism, functionalism, neo-functionalism, post-functionalism, transactionalism, and new supranationalism. So there are a lot of them, but they do not capture the essence of different types of crisis and how we end up with slightly different integration outcomes. Some bits of these theories also touch on some modes of integration, and again here we've got a lot of different modes mentioned in the literature, and this is a recurrent theme that carries on since even before 1996, the source that we cite here, but more recently in the literature after 2015, this idea carries on. So there are modes of integration mentioned, such as federal mode of integration, multi-level, tier 2, variable geometry, and a lot others. So then looking at this, we were thinking, okay, we need to find a more overarching framework for analyzing our case, just because the migrant crisis has not really been explored in detail in relation to European integration. And this is where the second body of literature comes in that we looked at. And this was the body of literature that looked at organizational learning in the EU, not specifically focused on EU integration. So the work by Radelli and Dunlop was really valuable here because they actually mentioned the idea of the EU being a learning organization. So they said that the European Union may well be a learning organization, and learning is one of the promising frameworks for the analysis of the EU. There are also a couple of things mentioned in some other studies in relation to EU integration, but of course this is not explored in detail, which is why we decided to take this focus. So then, yes, so we focus on learning, but then even though we use this word so much in our everyday communication, we need to explore the meaning of this term as well. So in public policy analysis, learning is often defined as a process of updating beliefs about policy based on lived or witnessed experiences, analysis, or social interaction. And then, like with a lot of other things, we've got a lot of different typologies of learning, and the one that we operated with was the single, double, and triple loop learning. So in the single loop learning, we face different changes that happen in organizations, but these are very instrumental changes in some sort of actions, but they don't undermine or change fundamentally the values of the organization. This is what double loop learning does. It changes more fundamentally the behaviors of organizations. And triple loop learning, it's like the next step that comes after changing values of organization, which is more about re-evaluating the context in which organizations exist and thinking what is best for the organization to do, which actually points to this idea of whether the organization should exist at all. So our focus is located basically on the verge of both of these bodies of literature, organizational learning specifically, learning in the EU, and also EU integration, particularly after the migrant crisis. And the question we ask here is, what modes of integration has the EU learned from the migrant crisis? And I'm going to hand over to Majella for a couple of minutes to explain our methods.
Okay, thanks, Iryna. So this, to make clear, that, I mean, as I did at the beginning, that particular focus on learning about EU integration emerged as a key theme in the data, and there's other kind of key findings, because the interviews and the work that we did was part of this larger project around Migrate. The work that we did for Migrate consisted of policy analysis and elite interviews, but prior to that we also conducted some discourse analysis based on search of relevant articles in the media in order to inform the interviews and the documentary work. So we did semi-structured interviews between September and November 2017, and I say we, actually it was Iryna that did all the data collection. There were 24 interviews in total. The majority of those 16 were in Brussels, and it's those that form the focus of this presentation. And we talked to were mainly people working in the decision-making bodies in the EU, plus a handful of researchers, policy analysts working for NGOs or think tanks. So this was very much a purposeful sample. Who should we talk to? Whom should we talk to in order to understand more about what was happening with the EU and EU integration in the context of the migrant crisis? The policy document analysis was collected both before and after the interviews, and was mainly done to generate a timeline of EU policy actions that were taken to tackle the crisis and to expand on some of the points that were mentioned in the interviews.
So I'm going to continue with the three main bits of our findings. So the first finding is that the language about learning came out as a very strong theme in the interviews. So the migrant crisis was a trigger for this intensive learning in general in the EU. And we've put a couple of quotes here for you and highlighted this learning language, so you can see that things like lessons that we've learned, we realized, our realization, we figured out, we found out, we were looking for meaning, we are in the process of sense making. So this language is a really, really strong theme. Then EU integration specifically seems to be happening through learning, and then there were a couple of pointers for this. One thing is that the EU has learned that the previous integration before the migrant crisis was not really effective. And we've got a quote here, the first yellow bubble, from an EU official who said that it, meaning the migrant crisis, raised questions about how united the EU was. These cracks existed before, but this made them visible. The migrant crisis made those cracks visible. And there were a lot of other things mentioned in the interviews, questioning EU solidarity and identity, European identity that was developed, had been developed even before the migrant crisis. The fact that the migrant crisis created more divisions in the EU, and things like the 28 member states is actually too many to reach any sort of consensus in the organization. Another thing that we came across was that the EU has learned to put migration at the center of integration debates now. And we've got another exemplary quote of this. Migration concerns was always seen as a side dish way down the list of priorities. Today, immigration policy is in the center. So we do witness this in a lot of discussions quite recently, and EU integration is seen partially through the integration of migrants, and there are a lot of discussions about creating legal routes for migration and attracting highly skilled migrants. And also the EU has been learning how to integrate in the future, but there's a very vague picture about it, and basically no one could answer the question, what is the future of EU integration? And this is probably the most illustrative quote of this: I don't know about the way forward. So a lot of EU officials mention things like this. And now more specifically about the modes of integration that the EU has been learning in the context of the migrant crisis and its aftermath. They relate to three groups of countries. One, candidate countries, another one, existing member states, and another one, exiting member states. But while we're talking here about a specific example, the UK. So in terms of candidate countries, the questions about enlargement, things about this have already been mentioned today. So further enlargement basically is questioned, and even though it's been 2 years since the data was collected, but we heard some sort of consensus earlier today about this question. And of course, we do recognize that there are some documents issued in this period from 2017, like a couple of communications of the European Commission on enlargement, including the most recent one in May 2019. But they all deliver very similar discourse that, yes, some countries like Western Balkan countries, they are seen as an integral part of the EU in the future, but no one is really specifying when this future is going to become the present. Leaning towards differentiated integration in terms of integrating member states. So we've got a quotation here: there will be an interesting development in this direction. The EU will move on with a two-tier approach. This will be the difference between these countries that want more integration in terms of economical and tax harmonization, migration, and some countries that want to stay behind. Another thing in terms of exiting member states, in terms of the situation with the UK, so we see that some sort of fuzziness is considered at the border between the member states and the exiting state. And again, that's the data from 2017, but even today we are we're witnessing the Super Saturday day when we've been waiting for the results of the vote about the deal, and well, we're kind of facing the problem that the vote may not even happen. So there has been this great uncertainty both in the EU and in the UK about a way forward, and it's still the case. And Majella is going to conclude everything that we've covered.
So just a few brief conclusions. This is a paper that Iryna has led on that's forthcoming in the journal European Review. So if anyone's interested, you can read more fully the arguments in that article. So just a few points to draw this to a close. So very much at the time of our data collection, so it was collected at a particular point in time, and according to our respondents and our policy analysis. So this is very particular to the people we interviewed. It's their narratives. EU integration for them became an intense learning process in this post-migrant crisis context, whereby the European Union was placing migration more centrally in its integration debates, and it was exploring a combination of certain modes of integration going forward. Firstly, trying to demarcate its external eastern borders by possibly restraining from further enlargement for the time being. And secondly, seeking differentiation among the existing member states, possibly through this notion of a two-tier EU. And this notion of two-tier is captured very much, increasingly in the literature, in terms of this notion of differentiated integration. So we won't have this homogeneous integration in the EU. It will become increasingly differentiated to try to take account of the diversity that exists across the 28 member states. And also considering the fuzziness at the borders with the UK in the post-Brexit context, if we ever get to that point. The final thing to say is about this notion of learning in the EU. So the idea of learning in EU integration, we could consider this as an overarching perspective to help us understand EU integration better, including in periods of crisis. So we need to think about the EU as a learning institution and how it integrates through a learning process. And as well, this institutional learning lens might help us in explaining why different crises lead to different integration paths of the EU. So it's something we're very keen to explore in future work, this notion of institutional learning in relation specifically to EU integration. Thank you.
Thank you.